Okay, many thanks, Ciprian, and many thanks for the organizers and sponsors for welcoming me here and putting up such a fantastic show. I think the venue is extraordinary, and the setting really speaks volumes about the organizational capacity of the team, but also about the commitment and interest that there is to this agenda. From the Brussels perspective, as a regulator, we make an effort to try and be in the member states, be in the countries, no matter what type of political presentations there are, what kind of ambitions there are, to understand what it is that allows them to engage or makes it difficult for them to engage. And I've already had excellent conversations with some stakeholders yesterday over dinner and today at the EU representation. And it is clear that it's not all perfect and it's not all a walk in the park, but that there is also a lot of enthusiasm and eagerness, determination, if you like, to move things forward. Now, today I thought I'd structure my presentation around three different things. Firstly, I talk about yesterday, so what happened recently and why we are now where we are. Then we'd talk about today. Where are we with the Green Deal? Where are we with the EU climate ambition? And thirdly, I would try and take a look in the crystal ball with you to predict a little bit the upcoming priorities for the next Commission, and also share with you how we from DG Climate Action want to shape that way forward, shape and inform the priorities for the next Commission and the next multi-annual financial perspectives of the Union. So let's start with Paris. Paris Agreement, undoubtedly a breakthrough in the international regime. We moved from an agreement that enforced developed countries to take action, but left many of the greatest emitters, including China, India, Brazil, outside of that action. So clearly, the Kyoto Protocol in such was incomplete, and it did not correspond to the contemporary realities that we had in 2015. So what we were able to carve out in Paris was a truly universal agreement that expected action by all to the best of their abilities. Some of the legal bindedness was necessary to forego in order to get that truly global movement forward. At the same time, we were able to make also sure that those more vulnerable countries had assurances that their futures would be safeguarded, and that we were all committed to maintain temperature increase within 2 degrees, and indeed pursue efforts towards that very important threshold of 1.5 degrees, so that it would not be surpassed. Now, just 4 years ago, and that was already 4 years after the Paris Agreement, the European Union was putting up its first program on the Green Deal. That came against the backdrop of the IPCC special report on 1.5 degree, which pointed to more ambition and action being needed if we wanted to avoid the more catastrophic consequences. And it came at a time when there was a really strong uprising of the youth in Europe. Greta Thunberg, the Fridays for Future, Extinction Campaign, all of that triggered a debate in the European parliamentary elections and made sure that the president at that time, who was still a candidate, needed to reflect that priority, the concern of the youth and the concern of the people in her priorities. So the Green Deal came about. At its core was the 55% reduction compared to 1990 levels in terms of CO2 emissions. And that really upped the game, because our previous commitment for the same period was that of at least 40%. So we were, as policymakers, frantically trying to get a legislation that would allow us to meet that ambition, and the Green Deal came about. It's a composition of huge, over the economy, whole of the economy, regulations, proposals, that allow for us to really pursue a transformative change at the EU level. And we've been working very hard. So coming to my next point, where are we today? We have put in place comprehensive climate legislation, but not only that. We have also put in place incentive structures that make sure that the ETS revenues from the emissions trading are used to feed innovation, to accelerate modernization, and to incentivize our industry to take those necessary steps for net zero transition. We have also revisited our common agricultural policy. Today, 25% of agriculture policy needs to go to so-called eco schemes. So that is sustainable farming, climate-smart farming practices, different use of carbon removals, and organic farming, for instance. In addition, it is up to the member states to design their strategic plans for the implementation of the CAP. And in those plans, they can reflect the challenges that they have on the ground in terms of climate conditions, but also in terms of the competitiveness angle and then introduce new seed structures. In terms of adaptation, in 2021, we put forward a new adaptation strategy, which again is a comprehensive proposition of several cross-sectoral actions intended to build resilience of economy in the different climatic circumstances. We're very proud of the things that have been put in place. Modernization Fund today stands at some 750 billion euro, made available for the 13 least advanced economies of the Union. Romania alone gets some over 25% of that total if the transfers are taken fully into account. In addition to that, we have the Innovation Fund, which is a pool of 40 billion there to support the most innovative technologies, to make sure that the EU stays ahead of the game in the global competitive marketplace for the net zero economy. Is the mic working? Yes, it's kind of going on and off, but I can live with that. So we have lined up the full arsenal of EU's policy instruments to try and make sure that both the industry and the society stay abreast and stay together for the transition. In terms of social justice and just transition, there is a social climate fund, which is intended to help the most vulnerable groups of people in the different countries. And that too has delivered a lot of success. We've put in place the taxonomy, and this is one of the areas where I've heard a lot of comments and views, and I think it is clear that there are many challenges in the way it's being deployed, particularly with the SME sector, who often don't have the ability to come with the proposals or meet the regulatory requirements that the taxonomy poses. So that's going to be one of my takeaways going back to Brussels. We're on track to meet the 55%. It will be tough and it will require resolve. And this is where we come to the tomorrow. When we go to the COP, we are going to be in a strong leadership position. Our international partners will see that EU is indeed walking the talk. We will be challenging them in the conversations around the global stocktake, which is the main deliverable for this COP, to come up with plausible and credible processes in view of preparing their next ambition stakes, their next nationally determined contributions. And in that context, the EU has already started its reflections on the 2040 target. Commissioner Hoekstra, in his hearing as a freshly designated candidate, was referring to at least 90%. That's a very ambitious target, and by the Commission proposing that, and it's not yet, of course, a proposal, we are not expecting member states or the society to assume a fait accompli, but that is an opening for a conversation that will then allow us to meet the deadline of the United Nations, which is well before COP30, which takes place in Brazil in 2025. So there's a leadership continuum feeding into the inspiration of the other countries, but also something that allows us to move forward in the leadership position, but not alone. Because EU alone counts for just 7% of global emissions. Clearly, we need to ensure that the global community follows us. So many people have been asking me in the past days, so what's going to be the success of the COP? What's it going to look like? I think a strong commitment from our partners to respond to the shortcomings in science in view of starting to prepare their next national determined contributions with a relevant ambition. We also need to deliver on solidarity. You may have heard of the Loss and Damage Fund, which is intended to help those most vulnerable countries of the world that are really dealing with the heaviest consequences of climate change, having contributed the least. So while the EU categorically rejects the notion of liability or compensation, because that's very, very difficult conceptually to verify, we are very committed to global solidarity. And in order for us to ensure that the multi-level governance continues to deliver, we need to also be there for the vulnerable and the least protected countries. In order to look at the COPs as a whole, it's also important to see beyond the negotiations. And here is where lots of the very important initiatives, such as the fossil fuel phase-out, come to play. Throughout the year, there's been international, plurilateral, bilateral conversations happening in the background, happening in the margins of the summit, trying to bring about consensus about the global commitment to a fossil fuel phase-out. And we've made some headway. In the G7 and G20 forums, we have already laid the ground, and we're quite hopeful that this will happen. We also expect there to be a commitment on renewable energy shares at a global level and energy efficiency. Those are leaders-level commitments that don't necessarily feature in the negotiations, but that are enabled by the pressure that the COP process puts on the leaders around the world. They expect some 70,000 people to show up in Abu Dhabi. I guess about 500, maybe less, of those are active negotiators. Others are active climate supporters, coming from corporate sector, coming from NGO world, coming from civil society. So it's really become a massive gathering of the like-minded in pursuit of a transformation. There's a lot of criticism at the same time as to, okay, it's a flying circus, what's the CO2 footprint, etc. And we're all entitled to have our own opinion. Personally, I think that it is making progressive headway, but of course there are possibilities to revisit the kind of composition of the process, and we would always need to keep an agile mind on that. So that's where the EU is. We are ready with our 2040 preparations. We expect there to be a broad societal debate about the commitment, because we, as regulators, cannot pledge something if we're not sure that the business, the citizen, and the academia, the stakeholders at large, they are willing to back us up, and they will stand by those commitments. Otherwise, it's just words, and that's not the business the EU wants to be in. However, no matter how much we do in the COPs and in the mitigation area, last year's events, the forest fires in Greece, the floods in Slovenia, the droughts in Spain, the landslides in Italy, have all borne evidence, undeniable evidence, of the climate impacts already being here and now. That's why the European Commission is carrying out the first ever climate risk assessment for Europe. So we will be looking at all different sectors and policies and their exposure to the negative consequences of climate change. We will also be assessing the intersection between science and policy by looking at our key instruments such as cohesion policy, common agriculture policy, energy sector policies, health policies, and looking at the readiness of those policies to deal with the increase in climate change. That means that when the next multi-annual framework for finance, which is from 28 to 34, kicks in, the conditionalities and the logic of our intervention, of our instrument support, will be guided not just by the mitigation objectives, but also by the fact that we will be working and living in different circumstances. So the risk preparedness will be reflected in policy preparedness, and we will be able to ensure that our economy and society has the best chances to deal with climate change. Now, this assessment is coming forward in the first quarter of 2024. And that's important because the European Parliament elections take place early June. We want to be there to have that conversation, to inform the definition of the priorities for the next Commission so that we can ensure the resilience of our union at face of the inevitable change. Yeah. So we don't get things perfect, but we have a couple of really important political narratives that we're trying to fill in. It's key for us that the citizen understand that we as regulators don't regulate for Brussels. We don't have a vested interest in making the policies complicated, but we do regulate for the people, the businesses, the civil society, and the community as large. And it is in that sense that we really need your active engagement, not just in the public consultations that take place, but also in the European parliamentary elections. I really sincerely hope that you will have the possibility to vote, because there will be challenges. The political undercurrents are not necessarily in favor of green. There are lots of conversations about the political middle ground, in fact, disappearing, and the conversations becoming more and more polarized, and I want to be honest about that. But I also want to be honest about the fact that independent of the political party in the European Parliament, there is very strong commitment and confidence in the EU's economic future being about net zero. There is very strong interest in protecting the citizen, which comes all to resilience and preparedness with the consequences that we can no longer avoid. There's also a lot of interest in making sure that EU stays ahead of its competitors that are now really pumping up financing for low carbon development. And we need to make sure that we are ahead of that game. I'll finish with 3 C's. And I think those 3 C's apply to policymakers, and they apply to us as citizens, as people, as parents, as children. And it is about, in times of defeatism and disinformation, we will only survive if the 3 C's we carry with us compose of collaboration, courage, but also compassion to those less advantaged in Europe, but also those of our global partners that we need to help moving forward. I thank you.